What's up, bedroom producers? It's Brian Lake again, here to take a look at Phonec 2 by Psychic Modulation, which is not an emulation of any one synth from the 1980s, but it is inspired by the mystique of video logos and worn-out VHS tapes during the 1980s. If you grew up during that time, you might remember the video logos that would splash on screen in the beginning of low-budget movies on VHS tape, and there was a very noticeable pitch warble effect that would happen because of the material and the way VHS tapes were made. It wasn't a sound we were crazy about then, but as the new wave revival picked up and eventually transmediated into the new synth pop revolution of today, and we have artists like Comtrues and whatnot, a lot of people are looking for vintage string machines or things that'll give you that old school character of the synths of yore. And as I said, Phonec 2 is not an emulation of any one of those synths. It's inspired by a lot of old synths, but it is its own thing, and it has a lot of character. It's very unique, and it's surprisingly flexible under the surface. There's a lot to cover, but I'm just going to go ahead and start off with some presets just to give you an idea of what this synth is all about. Okay, the Phonec patch that pretty much opens up when you open the synth up is just kind of a vintage string machine kind of sound. And, you know, there's a lot of sounds like that. And you can hear that pitch warble, which is a result of this circuit melt, which is some kind of complex pitch modulation algorithm. But I'm just going to flip through a few more of these. I'm sorry, I'm not a keyboardist, okay? I'm a sound designer. So don't expect any blazing solos. I'm just going to go down to some of these ambient. It's got some unique character. Okay, but it can also do some really cool sequences. So I'm just going to go over to the arpeggiation section. Flip through a few of these. And one thing that's pretty cool about this synth is that you can randomize things like the oscillators, the modulation. I believe you can randomize the sequencer. You can even randomize filter settings. And this comes in especially useful when you turn these things on and then you hit randomize and crazy stuff happens. Okay, or with the oscillators. Or with a sequencer. Or with a filter. Okay, so there's a lot of possibilities, and you don't even really need to be a synth programmer to make presets for this synth. You can just start randomizing things, and if you like what you hear, maybe you can kind of reverse engineer it. But anyways, I'm just going to go ahead and go to one of these initialize patches. And one cool thing is that inside this little pentagon here, you can hit default no matter what preset that you're using, and it'll go ahead and slam it back to its default settings, which is really useful, especially if you make a few mistakes or you move something, and you can just always set it back to where it was. So anyways, I'm just going to jump right into these oscillators because even though this is a 2-oscillator synth, which sounds incredibly limited, actually there's some really interesting mixing modes here. And I want to really go over a couple of these mixing modes because they're really unique, and I've never used mixing modes like these in any other synth. And I'm specifically going to talk about AND, OR, and XOR, which these three mixing modes are simulated logic gates that basically allow audio to pass through while the gate is opening and closing very fast, which results in a stationary waveform. But the audio that's passing through has phase values. The waveform will have phase values, very high settings close to +1 or -1, which is basically going to allow the peaks and valleys of that signal to pass through. And because of that, the waveform itself is going to resemble a pulse wave. And I'm going to show you that here. And I think I already defaulted this, but I'll do it again just for good measure. I'm going to go ahead into the mixer section. I'm going to turn that second oscillator up, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in AND mode with 2 sine waves. Now, as you can see, right off the bat, like I said, the waveform resembles a pulse wave, and that's because the high peaks and valleys of the signal are being allowed to pass through. And the reason that they're above 0 phase is because both of the signals are being mixed together, and so you got to keep in mind that they're bipolar. So when you add 2 bipolar signals together, you basically have a signal that's going from 0 to 2, and that's what's happening, and that's why it's really loud. Now, another thing that I really want to stress is that this seems very unimpressive until you start to alter the pitches of the 2 waveforms. So if I had that one down an octave and had this one up like a fifth, okay, that changes everything. And I'm just going to go ahead and show you what that time-varying signal looks like. Okay, I'm going to turn this trigger mode off, so you can get an idea. Okay, there's sort of a time-varying aspect to the resultant signal is very unique. You can also use these modes with the pulse waves, so you can use pulse width modulation. And when I use and when I turn down this width knob, I'm not exactly sure what's happening. I think it's because both of the waveforms are actually becoming like really narrow impulses. It starts getting really crinkly, and it's really interesting, especially when you start using the echo shifter and everything. Listen to this. See that? Okay, so that is really interesting. You got to take it easy because you turn it all the way up and it just completely closes it off and it's gone. Okay, but if you went ahead and you sent that through the echo shifter, you know, with a lot of feedback, you could do something with that. So those modes are very interesting. The AND mode basically combines the two signals and sends them through the gate. The OR mode will accept either or, depending on their amplitude, and send those signals through the gate. And the XOR mode will only accept one or the other, also depending on voltage levels, I believe. So there's also another mode called X-Wave. That's a little bit more unpredictable, and I don't know as much about it. But X-Wave, and I'm just going to like have some random waveforms, but it mix modulates the two signals in a really interesting way. I really don't know much about it, but you can get some really interesting waveforms going on with those mixing modes. So ring modulation obviously multiplies the two signals together, and then there's the traditional mix. So I'm just going to go ahead and default this patch. I also want to talk about, to demonstrate this, I want to talk about this phase drift, which is exactly what you think it is. It's going to cause the two waveforms, and I'm going to have them both retrigger at a phase value of 0. And you can see that the phase is drifting. And so that actually sounds really good in combination with the circuit melt. If you have the circuit melt turned up a little bit. And there's a little detune knob here. And if you detune it about, somewhere around 10 cents, you can type in the value there. And before you know it, you have, a pretty interesting... Let me go ahead and to the master module here and have it in polyphonic mode. It's a little too detuned. Okay. Let's make that a little bit lower, that circuit melt there. And let's go ahead and take advantage of that sub-oscillator. Bring that sub-oscillator up. You got to be careful with that circuit melt algorithm because you can go crazy with it. There's also an additional tape algorithm, which is kind of similar, but it's different. I prefer the circuit melt. Okay, and I'm not going to go over that shifter right now, but I will in a minute. So as you can hear, you can get those string machine sounds, and they're thick and they're full of character. This synth just has a really good sound. I'm going to go ahead and default everything, and I'm going to jump right into the modulation. You have 3 LFOs, 1 HFO, 2 modulation envelopes, and an aftertouch panel where you can make some assignments specific to aftertouch. The LFOs are pretty tried and true. They're not, the developer isn't reinventing the wheel here, but there's a lot of really, really good options for your targets, and you have some really good waveforms, like this peak and this dip waveform. If I sent that to the filter cutoff, turn the cutoff down. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and send that. Let me default that. But you also have the ability to sync the rate of the LFO to your host tempo, or you can adjust the rate in hertz. And then there's phase and depth control. When you click on this subtle button, it just makes the depth of the LFO just less dramatic. And then, of course, you have a high-frequency oscillator. And this is really cool because this can be an FM oscillator, or it can modulate the cutoff of the filter, similar to the cross-modulation filters in Zebra 2, which I use all the time. And it can also perform amplitude modulation. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to load up a preset in a file location here. I've saved a couple of FM bells that I've made. It's nice and pretty. I think I've got another one. Another cool thing about doing FM in Phonec 2 is that everything doesn't have to be FM. You can just do FM for one oscillator. You could do it for an oscillator 1 or oscillator 2. And you could do other subtractive things, so it doesn't have to just be it's all FM or nothing. And that's pretty cool. But I also like the ability to modulate the filter cutoff. I'm going to go slap everything to default. And I'm going to modulate the filter cutoff with a high-frequency oscillator. And I find that this is most useful when you have the filter turned down with a bit of resonance. And you have it like an octave or two down. And it sounds best with like a saw wave. And it results in some really, really squelchy sounds. And there's also a mod envelope, a built-in envelope for it here, which is especially useful for FM sounds with the level control. And then, of course, you can tune things in Sense if you want to get specific. I'm not going to go over amplitude modulation, but it can do that too. Moving right along to these modulation envelopes. There's two of them with controls I've kind of already discussed, and you've got main pitch, both of the oscillator pitch, the high frequency oscillator pitch, pulse width, filter cutoff, LFO3 depth, and the circuit melt. So you've got some good options there for these two modulation envelopes. There's this aftertouch panel, which is new for Phonec 2. There was a lot of requests for it, and I like it. I actually, I'm a big fan of aftertouch. I only have channel aftertouch on my MPK25, but I really like aftertouch, and I really like this ability to make assignments specific to aftertouch here. I think the only criticism that I think that I would give Phonec 2 is that I would really like to see the ability to make assignments like this for the mod wheel. While I'm talking about that, I think I'm just going to go ahead and demonstrate what I'm talking about. Okay, one thing I do like here is that I can right-click on a parameter, and I could just do MIDI learn by moving around that control. I'm just going to move my mod wheel for the filter cutoff, and it just, as you can see, go ahead and it routes it right away. And that's awesome. I just wish that I could determine minimum and maximum values for that assignment instead of mod wheel all the way down, filter cutoff all the way down, mod wheel all the way up, filter cutoff all the way up. It's not the end of the world. I just wish that I could set those values. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and default that, right-click, and I'm going to just make sure that that says none, which it already did. And I'm just going to go on to the Arpeggiator, which is like pretty cut and dry, tried and true sound. Like I said, in some areas, the developer's not reinventing the wheel here. It's a pretty simple Arpeggiator. You have cycle up, cycle down, up and down, up, down, 2, and random mode. These velocity modes, this mode, the note mode, will, of course, determine the velocity of each note, or the velocity of the arpeggiator in accordance with each note. And the constant velocity will basically add together all the velocity values of all the notes that are overlapping, or all the notes that are pressed down at once, and then it'll take that value and apply it to the arpeggiator. And this hold button will basically just hold the arpeggiator, and that will come in really useful if you're programming things so you don't have to hold the note down. I'm not going to do it here because it kind of messes me up, and I'm recording right now. But of course, there's this this gate, which is very useful, especially in tandem with the sequencer module. And like I said, you've got the ability to randomize these settings in the sequencer as well. And of course, there's kind of two aspects of this sequencer. There's this little doohickey right here, which will kind of give you an additional note up or down 2 octaves. I'm just going to say that it's fifth. And that starts to get kind of interesting, especially if you're like in random mode. And you can also determine the direction or the rate or the length of the notes, which will speed it up or slow it down depending on the length. But what I really like is this little step editor that's in here. And this is really cool because you can do things like you can modulate the filter cutoff. I'm just going to turn the filter cutoff down so I can demonstrate this, give it a little res. I really actually like filter B. And as I turn this up, okay, that starts to sound really cool when you start using the echo shifter and you have delay lines going on. But another thing that I really like is this glide knob, which will make those changes to the filter cutoff more gradual. Okay. And of course, when we start adding the echo shifter to things, start getting a little bit more interesting. Of course, that sounds terrible, so I'm just going to go ahead and default it. All right, on to the echo shifter. So another thing that makes Phonec 2 really interesting is that Phonec 2 has an external audio input, and that's really unusual for an instrument. But one of the reasons that I'm working in Ableton is that Ableton has the ability to send audio to an instrument, an input for an instrument track. I'm just going to go ahead and demonstrate what you can do in the echo shifter within Phonec 2, but then I'm going to go ahead and route Synth 1 to Phonec 2. Now, at first, it just sounds like an ordinary delay, but it has a pitch shifter here. And I'm just going to send that up like 10 cents. And you can kind of hear it, but it starts to become a little bit more obvious if you maybe turn the level up and turn the feedback settings up. Okay. And there's this phase knob. What that phase knob will do, basically adjust the mix level between the delayed signal and the pitch shifted delay. And that causes a kind of a bizarre phasing effect. It's kind of hard to describe. You just have to hear it for yourself. Sounds really cool. The only thing is you have to be careful with high feedback settings when this phase knob is at a value other than 0. There's a limiter, I believe, in the feedback loop because the signal can actually start clipping. I don't know why exactly. All I know is that if you have this phase knob anywhere other than 0 or 50%, you could actually start clipping with high feedback settings. So sometimes when I'm doing something with a lot of feedback, I'll keep that just turned all the way down. And also you can, similar to the LFOs, you can have the option here to sync the delay with the host tempo, or you can adjust it, I believe, in hertz. And then there's a low pass and a high pass filter, and then like I said, the level. So now that we've gone over that, I'm going to go ahead and arm the Synth 1 track. But before I do that, I want to go to this mixer section, and I want to make sure that this external audio input is turned on. So I'm just going to go ahead and arm Synth 1. And now I have to unarm Phonec 2. Okay, so you can hear that pad that's being fed into the external audio input being fed through the echo shifter. Which is really useful because I can imagine using Phonec 2 in an instrument rack in Ableton. You can layer instruments together and you can send the output of that instrument into this external audio input while you're using a preset in Phonec 2, maybe even fading in between the two signals. But this is a really cool ability to have an external audio signal being fed into this external audio input into the echo shifter, which is capable of making some really crazy sounds. But now I'm just going to go back into Phonec 2, and I'm going to go ahead and slap this back to default. And I've already gone over the mixer section. You have basically just global mixing controls for oscillator 1, 2, the sub oscillator, and the noise oscillator is really cool too. And I'm just going to turn this down. I really like how there's a low pass and a high pass filter control specific for the noise level right here within the mixer section, because I've made a lot of pads so far, and sometimes you just need a little bit of noise, just a little bit for that, you know, that good crisp high end. And I just like being able to just kind of adjust the low and high frequencies right there, so I don't have to mess with it so much. As for the filters, there's this really cool mix option here that you can have 100%, 75, 50, or 25%. I've not really seen that directly within a filter module in any other synthesizer that I've used. So that's really cool because it's just, it has a unique effect on the sound. So most of the times I'll just use it at 100%, you know, just because tradition. Like I said, I really like filter B, and it kind of sounds like a 24 decibel slope. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe it's 12 dB and, you know, 1 pull, 2 pull. And there's also a high pass filter right here, and I find myself actually needing a high pass filter, especially when I make bass sounds, to just kind of take off that ultra low edge. And then of course we have key tracking knob, which is pretty self-explanatory. I was a little confused by this at first, but you have your, you know, regular linear mode and your exponential mode for your built-in filter envelope, but there's also an inverted exponential mode, which will actually make your envelope behave in kind of a convex way instead of a converse way, which is good for pads. Amp envelope, pretty simple. You also have the linear, the exponential, and the inverted exponential, and of course you have velocity controls. Also, the velocity controls here too. This gain control kind of has the characteristic of a saturation effect, or maybe even like a little bit of a tube distortion. Which would come in really good for gritty bass sounds. I was worried about, everything kind of being mixed down to mono at first, but you can modulate the panning. And I've done this. I've modulated the panning for quite a few presets so far, and I'm happy with the results. But one thing, if you've tried to make synths in visual programming languages or in Reactor too, you will notice that when you try to modulate a stereo module or a stereo mixer with an LFO, you'll get these weird clicking, clippy, distorty kind of sounds from left to right when you're trying to modulate the panning, and none of that happens here. So it's nice and smooth. I don't hear any artifacts, so that's really good. And I've already gone over the circuit and the tape algorithms for the melt. One thing, I did talk to the developer, and he says that in an update we can expect an initialized bank, which will pretty much be 128, something like a solid sine patch. So we don't have to save over these presets when we're making our own bank. We can just go ahead and start from scratch. So that'll be exciting. But other than not having an initialized bank, loading and saving banks and patches here is really direct and straightforward. But all in all, that's pretty much Phonec 2, and it has a really unique sound. It's just a very special sounding synthesizer. I'm always working on the waveform level. I'm always looking at my waveforms through signal analyzers and through the spectral analyzer, and it's crisp and clear. The waveforms, some of the waveforms are very unique, like the saw waves have sort of a round kind of slope going from -0 to +1. Just a very, very sharp kind of sounding synthesizer without being overly digital and harsh, because it still kind of has that old school analog character. And like I said, it's not an emulation of some synthesizers. There's so many emulations on the market, but it just kind of captures the character of those old synths that we all know and love, but it still manages to be its own thing and has its own unique personality. So if you're looking for something like that, then I can't recommend this synth enough. It really is a great little instrument. Thank you. That's all I've got.